The morning Nora Hadley found out she'd inherited something. She was eating cold cereal at a kitchen table that wasn't hers, in an apartment she had 30 days to vacate, watching her 9-year-old daughter do homework on the floor because they'd sold the second chair 3 weeks earlier to cover the electric bill. The cereal was generic brand. The milk was 2 days past its date. She'd checked it twice before pouring it and decided it was fine. That was the kind of morning it was. The pile of envelopes on the counter had been sitting there for 4 days. She'd been pretending it wasn't there, which was easier said than done since it was the first thing she saw every morning and the last thing she saw every night. The gas company's disconnection notice sat on top. Under that was the credit card statement she hadn't opened. Under that was something from the county court she'd turned face down the minute it arrived because she wasn't ready to read what it said. The law office envelope was near the bottom, thinner than the rest, with a return address she didn't recognize. Harlow County Legal Associates. 3rd floor. Morrow Falls. She picked it up, set it down, picked it up again. Emma looked up from the carpet. She was doing long division, the pencil gripped in her fist, tongue pressed to her upper lip the way it always was when she was concentrating on something that required the whole of her. What's that, Mom? Probably nothing. It wasn't nothing. The letter told her, in language that was formal and careful and used the word heretofore more times than any letter had a right to, that she was the sole surviving heir of a woman named Cecilia and Marsh, who had died 11 days prior at the age of 89, and that Ms. Marsh's estate included a property located at 4 Dempsey Road, Harlow County, to be transferred to Nora upon payment of the county's minimum transfer fee. She read the sentence again, then the paragraph, then the whole letter from the beginning. She did not know a Cecilia and Marsh. The name meant nothing to her. Her mother had been dead 4 years, and her mother's family had always been something she approached the way you approach a dark room cautiously, not expecting much on the other side. But apparently someone up there had known her name and known her address, and had left her something anyway. The transfer fee was $7. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She set the letter on the table and looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Emma on the floor, then at the notice on the refrigerator held up with a pineapple-shaped magnet, then at the window with its view of the parking lot. 26 days left on that notice now. She'd been counting without meaning to. Nora Hadley was 34 years old. She'd been doing this, making a little cover too much, for her entire adult life. She was tired the way people get tired when they've tried hard for a long time without the ground ever quite leveling out beneath them. She grew up in Caldwell, a mid-sized city 2 hours south of the apartment she now sat in a house where things broke and stayed broken because there wasn't money to fix them and her mother had no one to ask. Her mother, Patrice, cleaned offices at night and sorted mail at a distribution center on weekends and was asleep by 8 most evenings, worn through in the way that meant she had nothing left to give even when she wanted to give it. Nora had understood this about her mother even as a small child, that gap between wanting and being able, and had filled the space herself. She did her own laundry by age 11, cooked dinner when Patrice worked late, managed the grocery list because she was better at math than anyone else in the house, which wasn't saying much, but was saying something. She put herself through community college 2 credits at a time over 4 years, while working checkout at a pharmacy and data entry at a dental office on weekends. She studied accounting, not because she loved numbers, exactly, but because numbers were honest in a way that most things weren't. A number didn't change its mind. It didn't disappear without warning. It didn't promise something and then revise the terms later. She graduated with a 3.8 GPA and no ceremony, because the ceremony was on a Thursday afternoon and she couldn't get the afternoon off from the pharmacy. She picked up her diploma from the registrar's office on a Tuesday, put it in a cardboard tube, and went back to work. Her mother had cried on the phone when she told her. It was one of the few times Nora heard her mother cry about something good. She was 23 when she met Daniel, who was funny and easy to be around and who made her feel, for the first time in her adult life, like she didn't have to carry everything alone. They moved in together. She got pregnant at 24. Emma came in February of a year that should have been a good one, and was instead the year Daniel decided that fatherhood looked different than he'd imagined it, and that he needed more time to understand himself before he could be present for someone else. He left when Emma was 2. He sent birthday cards for 3 years, then stopped. Nora stopped waiting for him to reconsider at roughly the same time Emma stopped asking where Daddy was. She rebuilt carefully after that, got her bookkeeping certification, landed a job at a small construction firm, and for 4 years managed to keep things level. Steady pay. A 2-bedroom apartment that wasn't much, but was theirs. Enough each month for groceries and the electric bill and Emma's school things. And sometimes, on a good month, a used book from the library sale or a Saturday afternoon matinee. Then the construction firm lost 2 major contracts in the same quarter. The owner, a man named Phil Beckett, who'd hired Nora on a phone call and a reference and had always been decent enough, cut the administrative staff first. He shook her hand when he told her. Said he'd write a strong reference. The reference didn't pay rent. Freelance bookkeeping work came in slowly. She picked up a few small clients, a part-time position at a tax preparation office that kept her employed through April and then let her go when the season ended. By summer, she was behind. By fall, she'd borrowed $600 from her friend Greta that she hadn't found a way to pay back yet, and that fact lived between them now, unspoken but present whenever they talked. By January, the landlord filed the notice. And now the letter. $7. She called the law office the next morning, stood at the kitchen sink with her coffee going cold, Emma still asleep in the bedroom down the hall, and dialed the number on the letterhead. A man named Arthur Greer answered. He had the measured, slightly apologetic voice of someone who regularly delivers information people don't know what to do with. He told her she was the closest living relative on the maternal line. He told her Cecilia Marsh had made her wishes entirely clear. He told her the property had been in the family since 1933. I don't understand why she chose me, Nora said. I didn't know her. She knew about you. A pause. She had a photograph of you and your daughter. Nora gripped the edge of the sink. How old was the photograph? Recent enough. A few years. He cleared his throat. I'd recommend seeing the property before you decide anything. It's a farmhouse. About 4 acres. It's been sitting empty since Ms. Marsh moved to a caregiver's home in town, which was roughly 6 years ago. Is it livable? The pause that followed was the kind that answers the question before the words do. That depends, he said carefully, on what you mean by livable. She drove up the following Thursday, leaving Emma at Greta's for the afternoon. 3 hours north on roads that narrowed and became less traveled the further she went, highway into state route into county road with no painted center line, and then the GPS losing its confidence and offering to reroute her back to civilization. She ignored it. Dempsey Road appeared behind a rusted mailbox post with no mailbox on it. She turned in. The track was packed dirt, half a mile long, cutting between fields of tall grass bent sideways by wind. A crow watched her from a fence post. The November sky was low and gray, the kind that settled close to the ground and made everything underneath look pressed flat. She saw the farmhouse through the bare trees before she reached it. 2 stories. A wraparound porch that had given up along the left side, tilting toward the ground at an angle that suggested surrender. The wood had gone gray, silvered the way old wood gets, beautiful in a certain light and alarming in a practical one. The roof sagged near the right chimney. 2 upper windows were boarded. A weather vane at the peak, a rooster, she could just make it out, was rust-locked and pointing southeast while the wind came from the north. She sat in the car without getting out. Just looked at it. Arthur Greer was already there, standing beside his car at the edge of what had once been a lawn. Gray suit, careful expression. He watched her get out. Miss Hadley, thank you for coming. You said it needed some work, she said, looking at the house. It does. Yes. How much work? He adjusted his glasses. More than some. She walked toward the porch. The steps were the first test. 5 boards, 2 of them soft enough underfoot that she tested each one before shifting her weight. She pressed the others with the toe of her boot before trusting them. The porch itself was better than she'd expected. Old wood, splintered in places, but the boards held. The front door was unlocked. The lock had given up during the years of vacancy. Arthur Greer explained, and swung open with a push and a sound like a word spoken by someone with a sore throat. The air inside was the first thing. Cold and still and layered with something she didn't have a precise name for. Not rot, though there was some of that. More like time itself. The smell of a place where nothing warm had happened in years. She stood in the front hall and let it come in. The house had been a real home. She could see that right away, the way you can see the shape of a good person even on their worst day. The floors were wide plank pine, the grains still visible under the grime, the boards thick enough that her footsteps didn't flex them. The plaster walls had cracked in a dozen places, but held. The staircase running up the right side of the hall had a railing carved from a piece of walnut, dark and old and solid. Someone had made that railing from a single piece of wood, shaped it by hand, sanded it smooth. It had held up strangers' hands for 90 years and wasn't done yet. On the left, a sitting room. Fireplace against the far wall with its grate full of leaves blown in through some gap she hadn't found yet. The mantel above was wide and plain, a single plank of pine, and on it sat a rusted tin box of matches and a stub of candle that had burned down to almost nothing. Someone had left those for whoever came next. Ahead, the kitchen. Stone sink, deep and wide, the kind made for serious work. Cast iron stove that looked like it had been there since the house was built and intended to outlast the house. High shelves along one wall with empty mason jars still sitting on them, lids off, waiting. A back door with an iron handle. And next to that back door, another door. Low-framed, heavy, iron handle that lifted rather than turned. She looked at it, moved on. She climbed the stairs. For rooms. 2 had windows. 2 had plywood where windows should have been. The room at the end of the hall faced north over what had been a back field, now tall weeds and a collapsed fence line. The floor in. That room was solid. The walls were sound. Someone had painted them pale blue sometime in the past, and the color was still there beneath the grime if she looked for it. She stood in the blue room and looked out at the field and tried to hear the house. Old buildings talk if you know how to listen. Not literally, she wasn't that tired yet, but through the way the floor responds to your weight, the way the walls hold or don't hold heat, the way the sounds travel or get absorbed. This house was speaking a language she recognized from her years of watching her mother's house try to stay standing. It was saying, "I'm tired, but I haven't quit." Back outside, Arthur Greer told her about the well, about the 4 acres, about the developer from the city who had already called him twice about the land. He was very interested, Greer said, with the slight flattening of a man who'd formed an opinion and wasn't going to state it directly. He left a card, asked me to pass it along. What did he offer? Greer named a number. It was more than Nora had ever seen in one place. It was also, she understood, the price of never finding out what this place actually was. Don't pass it along, she said. Greer looked at her. He looked at the farmhouse. He looked back at her. The transfer fee is $7. I know. It's not a lot of money for a difficult situation. No, but it's what I have. She drove back to the city and called Greta that evening. Greta listened all the way through, which was a thing she did that Nora had always been grateful for. Then, Nora, I know. It sounds like it's falling down. Parts of it. Important parts. The bones are good. The floors are solid. The walls hold. The porch lists. That's cosmetic. Mostly. A long pause. What are you going to do? Live in it, Nora said. Starting in January. The silence that followed had a specific texture, the texture of a good friend deciding how honest to be. Then Greta said, you have 26 days on the apartment. 24 now. And the farmhouse doesn't have heat. It has 2 fireplaces and a cast iron stove. I watch videos. Another pause. You watch videos. 3 hours of them. I know how to prime a hand pump and clean a flue and check plaster for structural soundness. I watched the plaster one twice. This time the silence was different. Softer. You've already decided. I need somewhere to be. Emma needs somewhere to be. And there's a school bus that comes down the county road at 7:40. You looked into the school. I needed to know it existed. Greta was quiet for a moment. Then, you know I'm going to help you pack. She called her sister Karen that same evening. That was the harder call. Karen was 3 years older and had, by most measurements, built the life Nora had aimed at before life rerouted her. A neat house in a suburb. A husband named David who kept the yard tidy. 2 kids and activities that required color-coded schedules. Karen had opinions about Nora's financial decisions and had never found a way to keep those opinions to herself, which she believed was because she cared and which was true, and which was also sometimes the most exhausting kind of true. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which told Nora the call was going worse than expected because Karen never listened without interrupting. Then, you are going to move your daughter into a condemned farmhouse. It's not condemned. The structure is sound. You described rot and boarded windows. Cosmetic issues, mostly. The foundation is limestone. Those walls aren't going anywhere. Nora, you have never fixed a house in your life. I fixed things. I fixed the dryer drum that kept stopping. I fixed the kitchen faucet. Those are appliances. Not there's a difference between a leaky faucet and a farmhouse that has been sitting empty for 6 years in the country. I know the difference. Then tell me you're not actually doing this. I'm actually doing this. Karen made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a groan, but was somewhere in between. What if I can't keep Emma in a guest room while David tries to be gracious about it? We've done that before. He's different now. Karen. A pause. I'm trying to help. Then come visit when it's warm enough. Until then, just know where I am. She gave her sister the address. Karen was quiet for a long time. Then, unexpectedly, you're sure the bones are good? I'm sure. Then fix the bones first, Karen said. Everything else can wait. It was, Nora thought after hanging up, the most useful thing Karen had said in years. She told Emma on a Saturday morning over toast. Put the photograph Arthur Greer had included with the deed paperwork in the center of the table between them. Black and white, old. A man and a woman on the farmhouse porch in what looked like the 1950s, the porch straight and new. A car visible in the corner of the frame. Emma looked at it. That's a house. Yes. It's old. Very. Is it ours? It is. Emma studied the photograph carefully, the way she studied things she was serious about. She turned it over and read the penciled writing on the back. Marsh Farm, Dempsey Road, 1953. She set it face up again and chewed her toast. Does it look like that now? No. It looks older. How much older? Quite a bit. But it's still standing? Yes. Emma looked at the notice on the refrigerator. She'd read it. Nora knew she'd read it. She was 9 and she could read anything. Then she looked at the apartment. Then at the photograph. Does it have a yard? 4 acres. What's an acre? About the size of a football field. Emma's eyes went slightly wide. She looked at the photograph again with the expression of someone revising their understanding of a situation. When do we go? They moved in on the second Saturday of January. Greta came to help load the car and didn't say a single discouraging thing, which was a form of love Nora recognized and was grateful for. She hugged Emma for a long time at the curb. Then she pressed a folded bill into Nora's coat pocket and said it was a going-away gift, not a loan. Greta, don't. What fit in the car? 2 suitcases, 1 box of kitchen things, Emma's backpack, the books they always kept the books, no matter what else got sold, the tools, and the trunk packed with groceries. Canned goods, dry pasta, oats, bread, peanut butter, a bag of apples. Emma called it their pioneer supplies. She'd been reading about the Oregon Trail at school. Emma had her notebook in her lap the whole drive north. She was making a list of things they needed. Real flashlights. Extra batteries. A broom. Matches. 3 blankets per person minimum. Why 3? In case of emergency, Emma said, as though this were obvious. What kind of emergency requires 3 blankets per person? Cold. Nora had spent December educating herself. She'd visited the farmhouse twice more after the first trip, once alone, once with Emma, and each time she'd written down what she saw and what it needed and what she thought she could do about it. On the second visit, she brought Emma, who brought her notebook and approached the farmhouse the way she approached most things, without drama and without hesitation. She walked each room with the notebook open, labeling everything in her careful, deliberate handwriting. Sitting room. Kitchen. The room with the bird nest. She stood at the window at the end of the upstairs hall for a long time, looking north over the dead field, the light pale and flat through the glass, and she said, "You can see a long way from here." She wrote that down too. At the bottom of the stairs on the way out, she found the cellar door. She pulled on the handle before Nora could say anything, and the cold came up from below in a rush, carrying that smell, earth and stone, and something older than both. Emma leaned in, holding the doorframe. "It's dark. I don't have the right flashlight today." Emma looked into the blackness for a moment, nose working. "It smells like something," she said. "Old wood. Old stone." Emma looked at her sideways, the way she did when she suspected she was being given the easy answer instead of the true one. She didn't push. She closed the cellar door and wrote in her notebook, "Need good flashlight." They drove back that evening, and Emma fell asleep before they hit the highway. Nora drove in the quiet with the heater running, thinking about that cellar. About the smell she'd been telling herself was old wood and old stone, which was true but wasn't all of it. She'd driven to the hardware store in Morro Falls, a place called Gill's Hardware, and bought a chimney brush and weather stripping and a box of chimney starter logs. The man behind the counter, Gill himself, gray-bearded, unhurried, the kind of man who answers beginner questions without making you feel like a beginner, had walked her through how to check a damper and what to look for in the flue. "You moving into a place?" he'd asked. "The Marsh farm on Dempsey Road." He'd gone still for just a moment. "Cecil's farm." "Cecilia?" "Yes. Did you know her?" Whole county knew Cecilia. He put her things in a bag. "Haven't seen a light on out there in years." He handed her the bag. "You need anything, you come back. We carry most things." She was grateful for the most. It felt honest. The farmhouse, when they turned up the track on that January afternoon, looked different under winter than it had in November. The trees were bare and white-frosted, the dead grass lying flat under a skin of ice, everything reduced to its essential shapes. The farmhouse sat at the end of the track like a thing that had been there long enough to be part of the land itself. The weather vane was still locked southeast, but Nora knew which porch boards to step around. She knew the front door needed a firm push and a slight upward pressure on the handle. She knew the kitchen stove had a good flue. She'd had a man from Morro Falls clean it on her second visit, and he'd charged her $80 and said it was sound as long as she was careful with the damper. They carried everything in from the car. Emma dragged her suitcase up the stairs, bumping it against each step with a rhythmic patience that said she'd decided this was simply part of the process. Nora made 3 more trips. When she came back in with the last box, Emma was standing in the kitchen looking at the cast-iron stove. "Can we light it?" "That's exactly what we're doing next." She showed Emma how. Newspaper first, then the dry kindling she'd bought in town, then 2 small split logs from the pile in the barn. She checked the damper, opened the air vent at the bottom, and struck a match. The paper caught. The kindling caught. She adjusted the damper by feel, and they both stood back and waited. 15 minutes later, the kitchen was the warmest room in the house. Emma sat on the floor in front of the stove, back against the cabinet, coat still on, watching the heat move into the room. "It works," she said. "It does. Can we eat in here?" They ate on the kitchen floor that first night. Canned soup heated on the stove, sliced bread, apples. Neither of them had a chair because Nora's priority had been tools and food and warmth, and chairs could wait. The lamp Nora had brought threw warm yellow light up the stone walls. The stove ticked and breathed. Emma finished her soup and leaned against Nora's arm. "Tell me about Cecilia." "I don't know much." "Tell me what you know." Arthur Greer had sent the deed with a short handwritten note tucked inside. "Cecilia Marsh, born in this farmhouse in 1935. Lived here most of her life. Never married. No children. Kept the farm going after her parents died, and then kept going alone after that." The note also mentioned, briefly and without elaboration, that Ms. Marsh had kept a small collection of family photographs on the shelf above the kitchen window, and that Nora's photograph, the one showing Nora and Emma at what appeared to be a park, Emma perhaps 4 or 5 in the picture, had been among them, displayed as if it belonged there, as if Cecilia had been watching from a distance for years. Nora had turned that over in her mind many times since reading it. Who had sent the photograph? Her mother was dead. Her mother's family had been scattered, largely unknown. There was a maternal grandmother she'd never met, who had died before Nora was born, or so she'd been told. There were cousins somewhere, names her mother had mentioned once or twice, and then not again. One of them, whoever they were, had known about Cecilia, had known about Nora, had decided those 2 people should know about each other, even if only in the way of a photograph on a shelf in a farmhouse neither of them had ever visited. "He said she had a photograph of us," Nora said. "Someone sent it to her." "Who?" "I don't know." Emma thought about that for a moment, the way she thought about things that required rearranging. The stove breathed. The wind pressed against the kitchen window. "Maybe she was keeping an eye on us," Emma said, "from far away. And when things got bad, she wanted to give us somewhere to go." Nora looked at her daughter, 9 years old, sitting on the cold floor of an old farmhouse she'd just agreed to call home, making sense of things. Maybe that's exactly what she did. Emma looked at the ceiling of the kitchen, where a faint water stain marked the corner. "We're going to fix everything. As much as we can. All of it," Emma said, with the finality of someone who has made a decision and intends to stick to it. She picked up her apple slice and went back to eating. The first week was hard in the ways Nora had expected, and a few she hadn't. The well pump needed priming, which took an hour and a half in below-freezing air with a wrench she'd borrowed from the barn and a bucket of water she'd driven in from town. She crouched in the snow, working the pump handle with both hands, until the water finally came up clear and steady and cold. When it did, she sat back in the snow and just stayed there for a minute. Her hands were numb. Her knees ached. The cold was the kind that got into everything, through the gloves and the coat and the layers underneath, until it was just part of what you were made of. She went inside and made coffee and sat at the table with both hands wrapped around the mug and listened to the house around her. Wind in the eaves. The creak of a board somewhere upstairs settling into the cold. The stove ticking quietly in the kitchen. Old sounds. The sounds of a house that had been making them for a long time and would keep making them long after she was gone. She found that steadying, somehow. The house had outlasted a lot. She intended to be part of what it outlasted next. The sitting room fireplace took another day. She cleaned the chimney herself with the brush from Gill's Hardware, going up through the flue with a flashlight tucked under her chin, pulling out a solid decade of nest material and debris and the collapsed remains of what had once been a very ambitious bird project. Then she laid the fire the way she'd watched on the video, newspaper crumpled at the center, kindling in a loose frame over it, 2 logs on top, and struck a match and held her breath and watched the smoke go up instead of into the room, which was everything she'd wanted it to do. She stood in the sitting room and felt the heat come. It was slower than the kitchen stove, more patient. It took 20 minutes before the room began to warm in any real way. But when it did, it was a different kind of warmth than the stove made wider, softer, the kind that reaches the corners of a room instead of just the center. She thought about Cecilia standing in this same spot. She thought about the farmhouse holding this particular fire for 9 decades and being ready to hold it again. She said, quietly and only to herself, "Thank you, Cecilia." Emma started at the county school the following Wednesday. The bus picked her up at the end of the track at 7:40. She stood at the old mailbox post in her coat and backpack and watched the road without fidgeting. When the bus appeared around the bend, she got on without looking back. Nora stood in the cold and watched it go and felt, for the first time in months, that they might actually be all right. The neighbors appeared gradually, the way neighbors do in rural places where watching comes before trust. Ruth Bellamy came first. A mile east, a white farmhouse with a rust-spotted truck. She knocked on a Tuesday morning holding a covered dish and said she'd made extra and thought Nora might still be sorting out her kitchen. Inside the dish was a chicken stew that was better than anything Nora had cooked in the past 3 months. She invited Ruth in. Ruth looked at the stove, the organized toolbox on the counter, the fire in the sitting room. She touched the stone counter without quite meaning to. "Cecil used to stand right here," she said. "I used to bring things sometimes, when she couldn't drive anymore. She'd be right in this spot." "Tell me about her," Nora said. Ruth stayed an hour. Cecilia Marsh had been a woman of few words and precise opinions. She'd grown her own vegetables well into her 70s. She'd had a cat named Thursday and a strong view on every election since Eisenhower. She was private but not cold. She asked for nothing and gave when she saw a need. She fixed things herself, Ruth said. Well into her 80s. You'd drive past on your way to town and see her on the porch replacing a board or in the yard mending fence. People offered help and she'd wave them off. Not rudely. She just didn't believe in needing what she could provide for herself. Ruth looked at Nora's toolbox on the counter, at the chimney brush on its nail. "She would have liked you." "Did she talk about family?" Nora asked. Ruth thought about it. Not often. Once she said something about people drifting. That her family had a way of losing each other. She said she hoped they'd find their way back someday. Ruth looked at Nora. "I suppose you did." Gill from the hardware store stopped by with a roll of weather stripping for the kitchen door, which he said had always had a gap that let the winter in. He showed her how to press it into the frame, and she did it while he watched, and he said she'd done it right. A farmer named Owen 2 miles down offered lumber from a demolished outbuilding, and she accepted and carried the boards in the back of his truck and stacked them in the barn herself. They were good people, these neighbors. The kind who showed up with something useful and didn't make a production of it. Dale Sutton was something else. She'd been warned about him by the tone in Arthur Greer's voice when he'd mentioned the developer, the careful flatness of a man keeping his opinion politely to himself. She saw the black SUV pass the end of her track twice in the first 2 weeks. New car. Moving slowly. Looking. He came on a Thursday in the 3rd week. drove straight up the track, parked where she was splitting wood in the side yard, stepped out in shoes that had never touched frozen dirt in their lives. 40-something, well-dressed, the easy confidence of a man who'd rarely encountered a negotiation he couldn't win. "Miss Hadley." He extended a hand. She set down the maul and shook it, her work glove still on. "Dale Sutton. I believe Arthur Greer mentioned me." He did. He looked at the farmhouse with the particular expression of someone calculating value while pretending to admire character. "This is quite a project." "It's home." "Yes." He smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach any further than it needs to. "I wanted to come in person. I've been interested in this property for some time. The land has real potential. 4 acres in this corridor, the road access, the topography. I'd like to make you an offer." He named a number that was more than she'd ever had at one time. She looked at the farmhouse, at the repaired porch steps, at the firewood stacked along the wall, at the window upstairs where Emma had taped 3 of her drawings to the glass, visible even from here. "Thank you," she said. "No." He paused. He hadn't expected that. "I understand the sentimental attachment, and I respect it. But if you've had a good look at what this place actually needs, the roof alone, the electrical, the structural work, I've had a good look. The cost to bring it up to anything livable would be, I know what it would be." She picked up the maul. "It's not for sale." He recalibrated. These things happened in his line of work. He'd been told no before, and he knew that no sometimes meant not yet. "I'll leave my card," he said, and placed it on the hood of his car when she didn't put out her hand for it. "In case your situation changes." She watched him drive away down the track, then looked at the card sitting on the hood of a car that was no longer there. It had fallen in the frozen mud. She left it there. That evening Karen called. "I spoke to someone in real estate up in your county," her sister said. She'd been researching. "He says the structure is basically unsalvageable. He says the property value is almost entirely in the land, and that a developer would likely want to." "I'm not selling to a developer." "Nora." "Karen." A pause. "I'm trying to look out for you." "I know. But Emma and I have heat and water and food and a school bus at 7:40. 3 weeks ago, we had a parking lot view and a countdown. This house has been standing since 1933, and it intends to keep standing, and so do we." Karen was quiet. Then, slowly, "You fixed the porch steps yourself." "I did. From a YouTube video. Mostly." Ruth Bellamy held the board steady. "Nora." But the tone had changed. It was something between exasperated and reluctant. "Send me a picture when it looks better." "I will. And call me if something goes wrong." "I'll call you either way." After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table. She'd found 2 chairs in the back bedroom on her first full sweep of the upstairs, solid ladderbacks that only needed the seat caning retied, and looked at the room. The stove going, the lamp on the counter, the weather-stripped door, the chimney brush hanging on the nail she'd put in the wall for it. Emma came downstairs in her pajamas, hair loose, holding her notebook. She sat in the other chair and put the notebook on the table. "I made a list," she said. "You're always making a list. This one's different. It's what we've already fixed." She read from it. The porch steps, the front door lock, the sitting room chimney, the kitchen stove flue, the well pump, the drafts in the windows. She looked up. "That's 6 things in 3 weeks. That's 6 things in 3 weeks." "The notebook from the drawer," Emma said, looking at the far counter where Nora had set it after finding it on the second day. "Have you read all of it?" "Most of it." Emma had read it too. Nora had seen her at the table with it on a Saturday morning. "She wrote a lot about the canning," Emma said. "And the garden. And when to check the pump." She paused. "And the thing about the cellar." Nora looked at the cellar door. Heavy frame. Iron handle. The cold that came from around its edges, even when everything else in the kitchen was warm. "The cellar goes further than it looks," Emma said, quoting it from memory, the way she quoted anything that had caught her full attention. "Father always kept the east wall for himself. I never asked why." "I saw that." "What does it mean?" "I don't know yet. We should go find out." "I know." Emma closed the notebook. Outside the wind was steady, and the trees along the track bent and held and bent again. The lamp threw their shadows against the wall, large and still. "Tomorrow," Emma said. "Tomorrow," Nora said, with the good flashlight. Emma nodded once, satisfied, and went back to bed. Nora stayed at the table after she heard the creak of Emma's mattress, and then the silence that meant sleep. She stayed there with her coffee going cold and her eyes on the cellar door. She'd been in the cellar twice since moving in. Brief, purposeful visits. First to check the foundation walls. Arthur Greer had mentioned them, limestone blocks set dry in the old way, and she'd wanted to see them for herself. They were everything he'd said. 8 inches thick, fitted without mortar, tight enough that nothing had shifted in 9 decades. The floor was packed earth, cold and hard. The ceiling low enough that she could stand fully upright with maybe 2 inches to spare. The cellar had a particular smell she hadn't been able to fully place. Earth and stone, yes. Old wood from the shelving along the near wall, where mason jars still sat, lids on, contents long since dried to nothing. Iron, from the door hinges and the hooks in the ceiling beams. But underneath all of that, something else. She'd stood there both times with the flashlight moving along the walls, trying to name it, and she kept arriving at the same unsatisfying answer. It smelled like something had been stored there for a long time. Not just vegetables or preserves. Something weightier. The smell of kept things. But here was the thing about the cellar. The kitchen above it measured roughly 20 feet by 18. She knew this because she'd paced it out on the second day, the way she measured everything she wasn't sure about, with her feet and a piece of string. 20 by 18. The cellar was larger. Not by a dramatic amount. Maybe 10 or 12 feet more toward the east wall. But 10 or 12 feet wasn't nothing. 10 or 12 feet of additional excavation in a farmhouse foundation in 1933, when everything was done by hand and nothing was done without reason. She'd noticed it on the first visit and filed it under things to investigate when she had more time. She'd noticed the walls in that eastern section were different too, not the same dry-fitted limestone of the foundation proper, but something else. She hadn't gotten close enough on either visit to see it well. The flashlight she'd brought was weak, a small penlight from the kitchen drawer that had barely been adequate for seeing the foundation at all. Cecilia's 3 lines in the notebook. The cellar goes further than it looks. Father always kept the east wall for himself. I never asked why. She'd found the notebook on the second day, pulled it from the kitchen drawer while looking for a spoon. Old paper, dry and slightly brittle at the edges. Half the pages written in a handwriting that was small and neat and slanted to the right. Cecilia's hand, she was certain of it without any way to prove it, the way you recognize a voice you've only heard once. Most of the notebook was practical. Planting dates, canning records, a note about the well, gallon output in summer adequate, check pump seal each March, a list of what the garden produced by year, going back to 1978. The kind of record a person keeps when they're alone and the land is their livelihood and there's no one else to remember. But the last written page was different from the rest. The handwriting there was the same, but the lines were wider apart, as though written slowly, each one considered before the pen moved on. It had the feeling of something set down at the end of something larger, not a journal entry, not a practical note. Something closer to an admission. She'd read it 6 times since finding it, and each time it landed differently. The cellar goes further than it looks. Father always kept the east wall for himself. I never asked why. And then nothing. The rest of the notebook empty. Arthur Greer had told her the family bought the land in 1933. The farmhouse had been built that same year, during the Depression, when money was unreliable in ways that left people with a complicated relationship to banks. When people who had things sometimes preferred to keep those things where they could see them. She was probably reading too much into it. Old farmhouses had strange extensions. Root cellars were common, especially before refrigeration. A farmer would have needed storage for vegetables, for canned goods, for anything that needed to stay cool and dark. The extra room might have been exactly that cold storage, accessible from the main cellar, practical and unremarkable. Father always kept the east wall for himself. That was the part she couldn't quite put down. Not the east room, the east wall. A wall, specifically. Not a space, but a surface. Something mounted there, something stored against it, something about the wall itself. She stood up, walked to the cellar door, and put her hand on the iron handle. Cold. Steady. The draft from the edges pressed against her fingers. Not tonight. The flashlight she wanted was in the car, still in the bag from the hardware store, a proper one she'd bought after Emma's pointed comment about needing a good flashlight with extra batteries. She'd bring it in tomorrow morning before Emma's bus came. They'd go down together, the way Emma had asked, and they'd look at the east wall and see what was there. She thought about the east wall as she stood at the door. She thought about what kind of man builds a farmhouse in 1933 and excavates an extra 10 feet of cellar beyond the foundation line, and then keeps that section of wall for himself, specifically and quietly, for the rest of his life, without ever explaining why to the daughter who would inherit the house and live in it for 50 years. A private man, clearly. A careful man. Someone who decided that some things were better held close than spread thin. The Depression did that to people. She'd read enough history to know that. The banks had failed in ways that destroyed families who trusted them, wiped out savings that had taken decades to build, and the people who survived it sometimes came out the other side with a particular philosophy. Keep what matters somewhere you can put your hands on it. Under the floorboards. In the walls. In the earth beneath the house where you sleep. She was probably reading too much into 3 lines written in an old notebook. She'd been telling herself that for 2 weeks, and it hadn't quite worked. She lifted her hand from the handle and went to bed. But she lay awake for a long while, listening to the house settle around her in the cold tick of the cooling stove. The way the wind found the one place in the south wall she hadn't yet sealed, the distant sound of an animal moving through the woods behind the field, and she thought about a man who built a farmhouse in 1933 and kept one wall for himself and never told his daughter why. She thought about a daughter who lived alone in that house for 50 years and recorded her planting dates and canning schedules and the precise output of her well pump in summer, and who noticed, somewhere near the end of all those pages, 3 things she'd kept to herself. The cellar goes further than it looks. Father always kept the east wall for himself. I never asked why. She thought about a $7 transfer fee and the way some things look worthless until you get close enough to see what they're made of. She thought about Cecilia Marsh, born in this house, who had known about a woman and a child she'd never met, and had kept their photograph on her shelf, and had left them the farmhouse and the 4 acres and whatever the east wall of the cellar held, without explanation, without instruction. As if she trusted that whoever came would know what to do when they got there. Nora stared at the ceiling of the pale blue room and felt, with the particular clarity that sometimes comes in the hour before sleep, that Cecilia and Marsh had left her more than a farmhouse. She just hadn't found all of it yet. Tomorrow, she told herself. The good flashlight. The cellar. The east wall. Tomorrow. The flashlight was a good one. She bought it at Gill's Hardware 3 weeks before the move, a wide-beam LED model with a rubber grip and a battery life of 12 hours, because Emma had written real flashlight, good one on the Pioneer supply list in capital letters, and underlined it, which meant she was serious. It had been sitting in the car in its packaging ever since, because every day since moving in there had been something more immediately urgent than the cellar. The pump, the chimney, the porch steps, the weather stripping. The first week was a long list of things that could not wait, and the cellar, whatever it held, was a thing that had waited 90 years already and could wait a little longer. The morning after Emma asked, Nora went out to the car before the bus came and brought the flashlight inside. She set it on the kitchen counter. Emma came down the stairs in her coat and backpack, saw it there, and looked at Nora. After school, Nora said. Emma nodded once. She ate her toast standing at the counter, looking at the flashlight. Then she went out and stood at the end of the track for the bus, and Nora stood at the kitchen window and watched her go. The morning passed in the usual way. She worked on the section of upstairs hallway where the plaster had cracked along the seam between wall and ceiling, mixing the patching compound in a bucket, applying it with a putty knife, smoothing it down with a wet finger. The work required patience and a tolerance for imperfection, because old plaster cracks in curved, organic ways that don't respond well to being forced into straight lines. You had to follow the crack instead of fighting it. Let the wall tell you what it needed. She thought about that. About following the shape of something instead of imposing one. She ate lunch, standing in the kitchen. She looked at the cellar door. Not yet. She'd said after school, and she'd meant it. At 3:45 Emma came through the front door with her backpack sliding off one shoulder and her coat half unzipped, the way she always arrived home. In motion, already past the moment of arrival. She set her backpack on the stairs and looked at the flashlight on the counter. Ready? Emma said. Let me get the work gloves. She pulled on her heavy gloves, the ones she used for splitting wood. She picked up the flashlight. Then she stood at the cellar door and lifted the iron handle. The cold came up the same way it always did. That same breath from below earth and stone, and the other smell, the one she still hadn't named. Emma pressed in close behind her, and they both stood at the top of the stone steps looking down. The flashlight beam cut into the dark and showed them the first section of cellar. The packed earth floor. The low ceiling with its rough-hewn beams. The near wall with its shelf of empty mason jars. Beyond that, shadow. Okay, Nora said. She went down first. 7 steps. Each one a stone set into the earthen wall. Each one cold through the soles of her boots. Emma followed close, one hand on Nora's shoulder. At the bottom, Nora swept the flashlight around. She'd been down here twice before, but those visits had been quick and functional. Foundation check, ceiling clearance, nothing more. Now she gave the space the full, slow attention it had been waiting for. The near wall, the one visible from the bottom of the stairs, was limestone block. The same dry-fitted stone as the rest of the foundation, tight and dry, nothing having shifted in decades. The shelves along it were pine planks on iron brackets, rough but solid. The mason jars stood in rows, their lids rusted to their rims. The floor was level. The ceiling beams overhead were hand-hewn, roughed with an adze, the marks still visible where the tool had struck. 8-inch beams, probably oak. They had not moved. Nora swept the light toward the east. The cellar opened up ahead of them, past where the kitchen floor above ended, extending further than the house footprint. She could see it now clearly, what she'd only half seen on those earlier visits. The space continued for roughly 10 additional feet before reaching the far wall. The ceiling height stayed consistent. The floor stayed level and dry. But the light showed something else that she hadn't noticed before, or hadn't let herself fully notice. The floor in the east section was different. In the main cellar under the kitchen, the packed earth was uniform and settled, the kind of surface that gets that way over decades of foot traffic and seasonal compression. In the east section, the earth was the same color but not the same texture. It was slightly raised in one area, a rough rectangle maybe 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, near the base of the east wall, as if something had been disturbed and then packed back down and left to settle over years. As if the ground there had been opened, once, and closed again. Emma saw it too. Nora felt her go still behind her. Mom, I see it. She moved the flashlight to the east wall itself. And there it was. What she'd noticed on the first visit and not let herself fully process. The east wall was not limestone. The east wall was brick. Red clay brick, laid in even courses with mortar between them, the surface flat and deliberate. Someone had built that wall by hand, set every brick carefully, mortared every joint. It was a different kind of construction entirely from the rest of the cellar, not dry-fitted stone lifted from the land, but manufactured brick brought in and laid with purpose. The mortar between the courses had darkened with age but hadn't crumbled. The wall was solid. But it was also, when Nora looked at it closely and moved the flashlight along its surface, not original. The limestone walls of the main cellar showed their age in the way of things that have been untouched, a slight mineral bloom on the surface, the moss of decades in the corners where moisture had once been. The brick wall had none of that. The brick was old, certainly. Depression-era old. But relative to the limestone around it, it was newer. Someone had added it after the house was built. Months after, perhaps. A year at most. They'd built the house, dug the cellar, let it settle, and then come back and built a wall. That's not the same as the rest, Emma said. No, it's brick. Yes. Emma was quiet for a moment. Nora could feel her thinking beside her. That particular stillness that meant Emma was organizing what she saw into what it might mean. Someone built it later, Emma said. It doesn't match. No, it doesn't. Why would you build a wall in your own cellar that didn't match the rest? Nora didn't answer because Emma hadn't asked her. She was asking the room. She was asking the wall. Nora crouched in front of the raised rectangle of earth at the base of the wall and pressed her gloved hand against the surface. The earth was cold and firm, packed so hard it didn't give. Whatever had been done here had been done a long time ago. The ground had had decades to compress and settle and forget. She stood up and walked to the brick wall and put her palm flat against it. Cold. Even. She pressed harder and felt nothing. No flex. No hollow sound. No give. Solid. She stepped back and looked at it in the full beam of the flashlight. 14 courses of brick, she counted. She was eye level with the 7th. The wall ran the full width of the east section, roughly 12 feet, floor to ceiling. It had a small gap at the top left corner where a single brick was set slightly proud of its neighbors, the mortar around it thicker on one side, as if that brick had been replaced after the others were laid. Replaced last, sealing something. She stood in front of that corner brick for a long time. "Mom," Emma said quietly. "I know. What do we do?" She'd been asking herself that question since the first time she noticed the cellar was larger than the kitchen. She had two answers, and they weren't compatible. The first, do nothing until you understand what you have. The second, you're never going to understand what you have until you look. She went back upstairs, left Emma in the kitchen, and went out to the barn. Owen's donated lumber was stacked along the near wall. Her tools were on the shelf where she'd organized them on the second day in the house. She found the cold chisel. She found the hammer. She stood there for a moment looking at both of them. She brought them down to the cellar. Emma didn't ask any questions. She held the flashlight while Nora set the chisel against the mortar joint on the left side of the top left brick, the one that sat proud. She positioned it carefully, angle into the joint, and struck the chisel once with the hammer. The mortar was old and dry, and it gave more easily than she'd expected, crumbling at the contact point in a way that sent a small puff of pale dust into the flashlight beam. She struck again, and again. The mortar along the left joint separated cleanly. She moved the chisel to the right joint. For more strikes. Then the bottom. Then carefully, with the chisel used as a lever, she worked the brick loose. It came free in her hands. She held it for a moment. An ordinary red clay brick, roughly 8 inches long and 4 inches wide, cold and dense, and almost surprisingly heavy. The face that had been turned outward was clean, slightly roughened by the mortar. The face that had been turned inward was different. She turned the brick and held it close to the flashlight. The inward face was darkened with contact with something that had pressed against it in the space behind the wall for what looked like a very long time. The discoloration was the dark, particular stain of metal, specifically of iron, and beneath the iron stain, something warmer. Something that had the color of old brass or of something that had once been bright and was now only the memory of brightness. Emma was very still beside her. Nora set the brick on the floor and took the flashlight from Emma's hand. She crouched and shone the beam through the hole where the brick had been. The light went into the space behind the wall and showed her the first thing. A wooden crate. Old, dark with age, the wood gone gray and dry but the joints still holding. It sat against the back wall of the space behind the brick, pushed close, and it was not the only one. She could see the edge of another behind it, and possibly another behind that. She couldn't tell how many. She could tell they were large, too large to have been brought through the gap, left by one removed brick. She pulled 2 more bricks from the top course. Then 3 more. She worked carefully, setting each brick on the floor beside her, keeping the courses intact so nothing above would shift. When she'd removed enough bricks to create an opening roughly 2 feet wide and 1.5 feet tall at the top of the wall, she stopped and shone the flashlight through the full gap. 3 crates. Wooden, iron-banded, each one roughly 3 feet long and 18 inches deep. They were stacked in 2 rows, 2 in the back, 1 in front, and they had been in that space for a very long time. The wood of the crates had gone dark. The iron banding was rust-pocked but intact. The lids were nailed shut, the nails driven flush. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She handed the flashlight to Emma and removed another 6 bricks, widening the gap until she could reach one arm through. She couldn't reach the front crate. She was going to have to take down more of the wall. She worked for an hour. Careful, methodical, a single course at a time. The bricks came free with the chisel in her hands, each one set neatly on the cellar floor. Emma held the light without complaint, moving it where Nora needed it, not asking questions. The cold came off the walls and floor and surrounded them steadily. Nora's back ached from the crouch. Her hands were cold even through the gloves. When she'd taken down 4 courses, she could fit through the gap. She stopped and looked at Emma. "Stay here. Mom, I'll be right back. I just want to see." Emma pressed her lips together. She handed Nora the flashlight. Nora went through the gap on her hands and knees, the cold earth under her palms, and straightened up on the other side. The space was narrow, maybe 5 feet deep and 12 feet wide, the back of the brick wall on one side, the original limestone foundation on the other 3. The ceiling was the same as the main cellar, the same heavy oak beams, the same packed earth between them. The floor was the same packed earth, slightly softer here than in the main cellar. Undisturbed, the 3 crates sat directly in front of her. She crouched beside the nearest one and ran her gloved hand along the top. The wood was solid. Old, very old, but not rotted. The sealed space had kept it dry. The iron banding was rusted, but the bands themselves held. The lid was nailed shut with square head nails, the kind made before wire nails became standard. Before 1900, she guessed, or not long after. The crates themselves were older than the house. She tried to shift the front crate. It didn't move easily. She got both hands under the side and lifted, and the thing was heavy. Heavier than wood. Heavy in a way that came from what was inside it, not from the crate itself. She set it back down, knelt beside it, put her ear against the wood and knocked twice with her knuckle. A dense, solid sound. Not hollow. Not close to hollow. She went back through the gap and stood in the main cellar. Emma was watching her with an expression that was trying very hard to be patient and not quite succeeding. "What's in them?" Emma asked. "I don't know yet. The lids are nailed shut. But they're heavy. Very heavy." "How heavy?" "I couldn't lift one alone." Emma looked at the gap in the brick wall, then at the crates visible through it, then at her mother. "We need to open one," she said. "I know. Tonight." Nora thought about this. The flashlight battery had another 8 hours in it. The crates weren't going anywhere. But she was cold and her back hurt, and she needed to think clearly, and she wasn't thinking clearly. She was thinking the way you think when your hands are shaking, and it's not from the cold. "Tomorrow," she said. "I need the crowbar from the barn, and I need to sleep on it." Emma accepted this. She was 9, but she understood that some things required sleeping on. She'd learned this from watching her mother, who never made a significant decision without first lying down with it in the dark. They went back upstairs. Nora made soup. They ate at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and neither of them talked about the cellar directly, though they talked around it the way you talk around a thing that's taken up all the space in the room. Emma said, "The bricks were put there on purpose." "Yes. By Cecilia's father. Most likely. Because he wanted to keep something safe. That's what it looks like." Emma ate a spoonful of soup. "From the banks. Maybe. Or just he wanted it where he could see it." "No, it was there." Emma thought about this. He never told Cecilia. She said she never asked. She wrote that she should have. Why didn't she? I don't know. Maybe she was afraid of the answer. Or maybe she respected his privacy. Or maybe she was just busy, living her life. Some questions feel like they can wait, and then they can't. Emma was quiet for a while. Then, she told us. Nora looked at her. "She didn't tell anyone while she was alive," Emma said. "But she left us the house. She left the notebook where we'd find it. She left the 3 lines." Emma put her spoon down. "That's telling us. Just slowly." Nora sat with that for a moment. The way Cecilia had arranged her departure. The unlocked door. The matches by the stove. The photograph on the shelf. The notebook in the kitchen drawer, last. Written page open to those 3 careful lines. Not an accident. Not a woman who'd forgotten to sort through things before she left. A woman who'd known exactly what she was leaving and for whom. She'd trusted Nora with something she'd kept secret for 60 years. Nora sat at the table long after Emma went up to bed. She sat with the lamp and the cold coffee and the cellar door. She thought about $7 and what it might have purchased. She thought about Dale Sutton driving slowly past the end of her track in his black SUV, calculating value per acre, seeing a crumbling farmhouse and 4 fields that could be subdivided. She thought about Karen, who'd looked up real estate contacts and determined the structure was unsalvageable. She thought about the eviction notice she'd kept on the refrigerator with the pineapple magnet, which she'd taken down and folded and put in a drawer on their second day here, not because things had gotten better yet, but because she didn't want Emma to see it every morning. She thought about what was in those crates. In the morning, she went out to the barn before Emma woke up and found the crowbar behind the woodpile where she'd left it after prying apart a section of damaged fence 2 weeks earlier. She carried it back to the house and set it on the kitchen table. When Emma came down, she saw the crowbar and didn't say anything. She made her toast and ate it and got her backpack and went out for the bus. At the door, she stopped and turned back. "Save it for me," she said. "I'll wait until you're home." Emma gave her a long look, the look that meant, "I am trusting you on this." Then she went out. Nora spent the day in the cellar alone. She took down the rest of the brick wall, course by course, setting each brick in a neat pile against the main cellar wall. It took 2 hours. When the last course came down, she stood back and looked at the full space behind it for the first time. 3 crates. And a 4th thing she hadn't seen through the gap, a metal box, the size of a small suitcase, tucked behind the rear crates and pressed into the corner of the limestone wall. The box was black with age and flecked with rust, but it had a hinged lid and a latch, and the latch was locked with a padlock that was also rusted but intact. She stood in the cleared space and looked at all of it. At the crates in their iron bands. At the metal box in the corner. At the packed earth floor where everything had sat, undisturbed, since the 1930s. She went back upstairs and waited. Emma came home at 3:45 and was through the kitchen and down the cellar stairs before she'd taken her coat off. Nora followed with the flashlight and the crowbar. They stood together in front of the 3 crates and the metal box, the flashlight throwing long shadows up the limestone walls. "You took the wall down," Emma said. "This morning." Emma walked to the nearest crate and put her hand flat on the lid. Then she looked at the metal box in the corner. "That's different," she said. "Yes." "Is it locked?" "The padlock is rusted. I might be able to get it open." "The crates first," Emma said. She stepped back. "I'll hold the light." Nora worked the crowbar under the lid of the nearest crate. The nails resisted at first. Old square-head nails, hand-driven, set in dry oak that had tightened around them over decades. She leaned into the crowbar, felt the lid flex, heard the first nail pull. Then the second. She worked the bar along the edge of the lid, popping the nails one at a time, until the lid was loose on all sides. She looked at Emma. Emma was holding the flashlight completely steady. Her face was absolutely still. Nora lifted the lid. The inside of the crate was packed in oilcloth, black and oily, layered in tight folds. She lifted the top layer and set it aside. And then she stopped. The contents were arranged in rows, wrapped individually in more oilcloth, each piece roughly the size of her fist. She lifted one of them and unwrapped it. Gold. A coin, round and heavy and dense, the size of a silver dollar, but heavier, much heavier. The face was worn smooth at the high points, but the design was still clear, a striding figure, wings outstretched, arm raised, the date below. She turned it over. An eagle in flight. The words on the reverse visible in the flashlight beam, $20. A double eagle. She knew the name because she'd seen it in a book once, years ago, a library book about American coins that she'd read cover to cover on a slow Sunday, because it was there and she read everything that was there. $20 gold pieces, minted by the United States government from 1849 to 1933. Struck from $20 worth of gold at the time of their minting, which was not the same thing as their value now. Not even close. Minted until 1933, the same year the farmhouse was built. She sat back on her heels and held the coin in her gloved hand and looked at it in the beam of the flashlight. The gold caught the light and held it the way gold always does, that particular warm heaviness that doesn't look like any other metal. "What is it?" Emma's voice was very quiet. "A gold coin." "Gold?" "Yes. Real gold. Real gold." A pause. "How much is it worth?" Nora turned it over in her hand. She was a bookkeeper. She understood numbers and their relationships to other numbers. She knew that gold coins of this type, pre-1933, in good condition, were valuable. Not just their gold content, their numismatic value. The collector's premium for coins that had been pulled from circulation and hoarded during the Depression, some of them so rare that even a single one was worth thousands. "I don't know exactly," she said. "We'd need someone who knows coins. How many are in there?" She looked at the crate. The oilcloth parcels in their rows. Each parcel, she estimated, about the size and weight of the one she was holding. She counted the rows. 4 rows across, 6 rows deep, roughly. Maybe more beneath. Maybe 24 per layer, and she couldn't see how many layers deep the crate went. She set the coin down carefully and counted the parcels in the top layer. 26. She pressed gently at the edges and felt more parcels below. At least another layer, possibly 2. She looked at the 3 crates. "I don't know how many are in this one yet," she said. "And there are 3 crates." Emma was silent for a long time. The flashlight didn't waver. Then, "Mom, I know. That's a lot of gold." "Yes." "Like a lot." "Yes." Emma sat down on the cellar floor, flashlight still pointed at the crate, and didn't say anything for a while. Nora could hear her breathing. Even, steady, the way Emma's breathing always was when she was thinking hard. "The metal box," Emma said finally. Nora looked at it in the corner. She stood up and walked to it and crouched in front of the padlock. The lock was a standard hasp padlock, the kind that had been common for 100 years, a steel body with a shackle through the clasp. The steel was pitted with rust, but not eaten through. She looked at it carefully, then sat back and thought. She went upstairs and came back with the bottle of penetrating oil she used on the barn hinges, the hammer, and a screwdriver with a flat blade. She worked the oil into the lock mechanism, let it sit for 10 minutes, then tapped the lock body lightly with the hammer. Then again, sharper. On the fourth strike, the shackle released. Not fully, the rust held it slightly, but she was able to work it free with the screwdriver as a lever, and the padlock came open. She lifted the lid of the metal box. Inside, wrapped in oilskin in the same careful way as the coins in the crates, were papers. Not just a few. A deep stack of documents, each one folded and wrapped, organized in some order she couldn't immediately read. She lifted the top packet and unwrapped it slowly. A certificate. Official-looking, government-issued, old, with elaborate engraving around the border and a government seal near the bottom. She moved the flashlight over it carefully. She could read the denomination printed in the center, $100. She could read the issuing institution, United States of America. She could read the type, gold certificate. Paper currency backed by gold, issued before the country moved off the gold standard. Withdrawn from circulation and illegal to own after 1933, except that they hadn't all been surrendered. Some had been kept, hidden, folded into oilskin and put into metal boxes by people who didn't trust what was coming next. Her understanding was vague on the legal details, but her understanding of the value was not. Old paper currency of this type, in good condition, was worth multiples of its face value to collectors. There were more packets in the box. She didn't count them tonight. She looked at Emma, who was watching her from across the space, flashlight steady, face very still. There are papers too, Nora said. Documents. Old currency. Are they worth something? I think so. I don't know how much. Emma was quiet. The cellar was quiet around them, the cold steady, the packed earth floor beneath them, 90 years of undisturbed silence pressing in on all sides. Then Emma said something she'd said before, in a different context, in a different kind of room, but with the same quiet certainty she always used when she knew something was true. We need to call someone. In the morning, Nora called Arthur Greer. She'd thought about who to call first. Gil at the hardware store. Ruth Bellamy, a coin dealer, if she could find one. But Arthur Greer knew this property and its history, had known Cecilia, had handled the estate. He was the right first call. He picked up on the second ring. She told him what they'd found. The brick wall, the crates, the coins, the metal box. She told him without drama, in the same voice she used when she called clients to go over their quarterly accounts, because she needed to be understood clearly and she needed him to believe her. He was quiet for a long time when she finished. Miss Hadley, he said, I know how it sounds. I need to ask you something. His voice was measured, careful, the voice of a man rearranging his understanding of a situation. Did she ever indicate to you, directly or in writing, that she knew about this? There's a notebook, 3 lines on the last page. She read them to him. He was silent for a moment. She knew, he said, quietly, to himself, the way a person speaks when something that had been puzzling them for years suddenly resolves. She knew and she chose to leave it as it was. She chose to leave it to someone who might look, Nora said. Someone who would be paying attention. He was quiet again. Then, you need a numismatist. A coin appraiser, professional, ideally one who specializes in pre-1933 American gold. You'll also want someone for the paper currency that's a different specialty. And you should document everything before anyone touches anything. Photographs, video, a detailed written inventory. I have a phone. Use it. Photograph every coin individually if you can. Every document. Every layer. Don't move anything until you have a record. Should I call anyone else? Not yet. He paused. I'll be honest with you. If what you're describing is accurate, and I believe it is, you're looking at something that's going to require careful handling. The legal status of pre-1933 gold certificates was clarified in 1977. They're legal to own, and double eagles have been collectible for decades. But there may be questions about provenance, about inheritance law as it applies to contents found within inherited property. I want to look into this before you speak to anyone officially. Am I in any trouble? No. You inherited the property and everything in it. but I want to make sure the paperwork is unambiguous before this becomes public. She appreciated that. The word public. The implication that it would become public, and that the timing of that mattered. She spent the rest of that day in the cellar with her phone, photographing everything. She photographed the cleared space, the 3 crates, the metal box. She photographed each crate from multiple angles before opening it further. She photographed the coins still in their oilcloth wrapping, and then each coin individually, both faces. When her phone storage ran low, she deleted old photos she didn't need, screenshots she'd been keeping, a video Emma had taken of the cat that visited the barn sometimes and kept photographing. The second crate held more double eagles, same as the first. The third crate was different. The third crate contained silver. Morgan dollars and peace dollars, the same careful oilcloth wrapping, the same dense, organized rows. There were hundreds of them. She couldn't count them all without moving each one, and she wasn't going to do that without the appraiser present. She photographed the top layer and closed the lid and left it. She counted what she could count. 26 coins in the top layer of the first crate, 2 additional layers below that. That was approximately 78 coins in the first crate alone, assuming even distribution. 3 crates total, though the third held silver, not gold. She didn't know the silver content well enough to estimate. She knew the gold. The current gold price was something she'd looked up on her phone, sitting at the kitchen table the night before. The gold content in a double eagle, roughly an ounce, put its melt value at something she'd written on a piece of paper and then looked at for a long time. But that was melt value. For uncirculated or lightly circulated pre-1933 coins in good condition, the numismatic premium could be multiples of that. She'd found a few references online during a half-hour of reading. Some double eagles sold for a few thousand. Some sold for tens of thousands. Condition mattered enormously. Rarity of the specific year and mint mark mattered. She couldn't know the total without a professional, but she could do rough math. She'd always been able to do rough math. 78 coins minimum in the first crate, even at the conservative end of what she'd read. Even imagining these were common dates, moderate condition, nothing exceptional. She wrote the number down, looked at it, and set down her pen. It was more than she'd earned in the last 4 years combined. And that was 1 crate, conservative estimate, before the silver, before the paper currency, before whatever premium applied to the rarity of specific years. That evening, for the first time in as long as she could remember, Nora Hadley sat at her kitchen table and cried. Not from grief, not from fear, from the particular release that comes after a long time of holding everything up by yourself, the specific physical sensation of something heavy being set down. Emma came and sat beside her. She didn't ask what was wrong, because Emma understood that this was not a thing that was wrong. She just put her arm around her mother's shoulders and leaned against her, and they sat together while the stove made its small sounds, and the wind moved outside, and the winter dark settled around the farmhouse on Dempsey Road. After a while, Emma said, "We're going to be okay." Nora wiped her face. "We are. Really okay. Yes. Like school supplies okay." She almost laughed. "Much better than school supplies okay." "Good." Emma tightened her arm briefly and then let go. "I want to get the good colored pencils. The ones in the tin." "The tin ones," Nora said. "Absolutely." Arthur Greer called back 2 days later with a name. Philip Schoenfeld, a coin dealer and appraiser based in the city, 4 hours south, who specialized in American pre-1933 gold and silver. Greer had known him for 20 years. He had credentials from 3 numismatic associations. He was trustworthy. He'd seen things like this before, though not often. She called Philip Schoenfeld the same afternoon. He answered with the slightly distracted energy of a man surrounded by objects that required careful attention, and she told him what she had, quickly and precisely, the way she'd told Greer, without drama. He was quiet for longer than Greer had been. Then, "Photographs," he said. "Can you send me photographs?" She sent 47. He called back in an hour. His voice was different from before, not distracted. Very focused. "Ms. Hadley, I'd like to come see these in person. This week if possible. I'm available any day. Thursday. I can be there Thursday morning." A pause. "I'm looking at your photos of what I believe is a 1927 D double eagle, if I'm reading the images correctly. I don't know the year or mint mark yet. I haven't handled them beyond the first one." "The 1927 D," he said, as if she hadn't spoken. was struck at the Denver Mint. Just under 200,000 were produced. Of those, almost none entered circulation. Most were melted in 1933 when the government recalled gold. The ones that survived are extremely rare. Another pause. If that coin is what the image suggests, it's not a common double eagle. How uncommon? He was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice had taken on the careful, measured quality of a professional who knows that he is about to say something that will change the conversation completely and is choosing his words because of it. I need to assess the condition and confirm the date and mint mark before I give you any numbers. I don't speculate before I've held a coin in my hand. He paused. But I can tell you that in 2002, a 1927 D double eagle in similar apparent condition sold at auction for over $400,000. Nora set down her coffee cup. One coin, he said. One coin, she said. And you indicated there appear to be multiple crates. The line was quiet for a moment. Thursday, he said. I'll be there first thing Thursday. She hung up and sat at the table and looked at the kitchen. At the stone sink and the cast iron stove and the walls she'd patched and the door with its new weather stripping. At the lamp on the counter and the chimney brush on its nail and the mason jars she'd cleaned and arranged on the shelf because the shelf was there and the jars were there and things should go where they fit. She thought about a man in 1933 who dug 10 feet of extra cellar by hand and built a brick wall to close it off and filled 3 wooden crates with his gold and locked his papers in a metal box and never told his daughter why. She thought about Cecilia, who had lived in this house for 50 years knowing the wall was there and never asking about it, and who had spent the last years of her life deciding who to leave it to. She thought about a photograph on a shelf, a woman she'd never met, who had kept her eye on a woman and a little girl from 3 hours away and had decided them. Those two. When the time comes. Outside the kitchen window, the January field was white and still under a pale sky, the line of trees at the far edge bare and black against the cold. Somewhere out there, under the snow, the ground held everything that had been put into it and didn't give it back until it was ready. Nora Hadley looked at the cellar door. She'd lived 34 years. She'd worked 2 jobs and lost one and borrowed money from a friend and sold a chair to pay a bill and eaten generic cereal on a morning when the refrigerator had nothing better in it. She'd raised a daughter alone on a bookkeeper's salary and she'd done it without asking for much, and she'd been quietly proud of that. The way you're proud of things you've accomplished through endurance rather than luck. She thought she understood what this was. This was not luck. This was something Cecilia Marsh had built over a lifetime. The slow accumulation of a deliberate trust. She'd watched. She'd decided. She'd arranged her departure with the care of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and why. She'd left a door unlocked, matches by the stove, a photograph on the shelf, and 3 lines in a notebook. All of it pointing here. Thursday, Philip Schoenfeld would drive 4 hours north with his magnifying glass and his assessment scales and his 40 years of experience handling old American gold, and he would tell Nora what she had. He would give her numbers, and those numbers would begin to change the shape of everything. She was ready. She'd been getting ready since the morning she picked up an envelope addressed to her from a law office she'd never heard of, from a woman she'd never met, and decided that whatever was on the other side of it was worth opening. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. Philip Schoenfeld arrived at 8:15 in the morning in a car that was older than Dale Sutton's by 20 years and less impressive by every measure except the one that mattered, which was that it got him here. He was in his mid-60s, shorter than she'd imagined from his voice on the phone, with wire-rimmed glasses and a canvas bag he carried with both hands. He wore a coat that had seen a lot of weather. He shook Nora's hand at the door and said, "Show me." She took him to the cellar. He went through the gap in the brick wall the courses she hadn't yet replaced, leaving the space open and crouched in front of the crates without touching them. He looked for a long time. Then he opened the canvas bag and removed a headlamp, a jeweler's loupe, a set of cotton gloves, and a small digital scale. He put the headlamp on. He put the cotton gloves on. He looked at Nora. "May I?" She nodded. He opened the first crate himself, taking the lid off with the careful deliberateness of a man who had learned that patience is the best tool he owns. He lifted the top oilcloth layer. He looked at the rows of wrapped coins. He lifted the nearest one and unwrapped it slowly, and when the gold came into the beam of his headlamp, he held it for a long moment without speaking. Then he lifted his loupe and looked at the coin through it. He rotated it. He looked at the obverse, the reverse, the rim. He set the coin on the scale and read the weight. He did all of this without saying a word. He set the coin down. He lifted another, then another. He worked through the top layer systematically, examining each coin in turn, making small notes in a spiral notebook he pulled from his coat pocket. He worked for 40 minutes without speaking. Nora stood at the edge of the cleared space and watched. Emma had gone to school. She hadn't wanted to miss the appraisal. But Nora had pointed out that missing school for the appraisal and the one after that and the one after that would be a pattern, and Emma had gone, under protest, with Nora's promise to tell her everything when she got home. Schoenfeld worked through the second layer of the first crate. Then he sat back on his heels and looked at his notes. "Miss Hadley," he said. He didn't turn around yet. "Yes. How did you find this place?" "I inherited it." "From who?" "A woman named Cecilia Marsh. She was 90 years old when she died. This was her family's farm." He was quiet for a moment. She didn't know this was here? She knew the wall existed. She knew her father kept it for himself. She never looked behind it. He turned around then. The headlamp was off now, and his face was lit by the flashlight Nora had propped against the crate, and his expression was the expression of a man who has spent his life handling old things and has learned not to show what they're worth in his face, and was right now failing at that. "The 1927D," he said. "There are 4 of them in the top layer alone. Do you know what that means?" "You mentioned $400,000. For one." "I mentioned that as a reference point. An auction result from 2002. The market has moved since then." He looked at his notes. "I also found 3 1933 St. Gaudens. Do you know what those are?" She did not. In 1933, the United States government called in all gold coins for surrender. The mint had struck nearly 500,000 double eagles that year before the recall. Almost all were melted. A small number were legally exported before the recall took effect. A small number were illegally retained. He paused. "There is one 1933 double eagle one that is legal to own in the United States. It sold at auction in 2021 for $18.9 million. The seller was very quiet. "The ones I'm looking at are not that coin," he said carefully. "Their ownership history makes them a different category legally, and their condition is varied. But they exist. They are real. And they are coins that most appraisers never see in a lifetime." He looked at her steadily over his wire-rimmed glasses. "I need to do a full assessment. All 3 crates, the silver, the paper currency in the metal box. This will take me the rest of the day and possibly part of tomorrow." "I'll make coffee," Nora said. He worked until 4 in the afternoon, when the cold in the cellar became too much for his hands, even in gloves. He came upstairs and sat at the kitchen table with his notebook and his coffee and his glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he looked at what he'd written, and then he looked at Nora. "I'm not going to give you a final number today," he said. "A proper appraisal of coins like these requires cleaning assessment, full date and mint mark confirmation on every piece, condition grading, current market comparable review. That's a process, not an afternoon." "I understand, but I can give you a preliminary range." He looked at his notes. "Gold content alone, just the melt value of the gold in those 2 crates approaches $750,000 at current prices. The numismatic premium on what I've seen today is significant, potentially very significant, depending on final assessment." He held her gaze. "The preliminary range I'm comfortable with is broad, but the low end of that range is something I don't think you're expecting." She held herself still. "Tell me the low end." He told her. She looked at the table, at her coffee cup, at the kitchen wall where Emma had drawn a small sun in pencil on her second day in the house, deciding to leave her mark on the place, deciding it was theirs. Nora had painted over it when she did the walls, but she'd painted around the sun carefully, left it exactly as Emma had drawn it. She looked at the sun on the wall. "And the high end," she said. He told her that too. She was quiet for a long time after he left. He would come back Friday to finish the silver and the paper currency. He'd have a formal appraisal document within 2 weeks. He'd referred her to a colleague who specialized in old paper currency, who would need to be brought in separately. She sat at the kitchen table in the winter afternoon light, and she held the numbers in her mind the way you hold a new language carefully, not yet natural, repeating the words until they started to feel like something you owned. Emma came home at 3:45 and stood in the kitchen doorway with her backpack on and looked at her mother's face. "Tell me," Emma said. Nora told her. Emma sat down. She was quiet for a full minute, which was long for Emma, who processed things quickly and moved on to the next thing. Then she said, "Enough to fix the roof?" Nora looked at her. "Enough to fix every roof we will ever live under for the rest of our lives." Emma nodded slowly. Then, and the colored pencils. Every color they make. Emma got up, set her backpack on the stairs, and came and sat next to her mother. They sat there together at the kitchen table while the light went out of the afternoon, and the stove ticked and the farmhouse held them in its old walls, and neither of them said anything for a while, because some things, when they finally arrive, don't need words yet. They just need to be sat with, felt, let to settle into the shape of what they've changed. Outside, down Dempsey Road, past the bare trees and the frost-whitened fields, Dale Sutton's black SUV had passed the end of the track twice already that week. Twice more would pass before he found out what was happening inside the farmhouse he'd been trying to acquire. And when he found out, the look on his face would be the kind of look that only arrives when a man realizes he calculated the value of something using entirely the wrong measurement. But that was coming. For now, the farmhouse on Dempsey Road held its quiet, and the woman and the girl inside it held their enormous, unfolding secret, and outside the kitchen window the winter field was white and still, and the weather vane on the roof had not moved from southeast in years and years. It was about to. The formal appraisal document arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Philip Schoenfeld's first visit to the cellar. He came back twice more, once for the silver, once with a paper currency specialist named Dora Weiss, a small, precise woman in her 50s who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke about pre-1933 gold certificates with the reverence of a person in the presence of something she'd spent her career hoping to encounter. She spent 6 hours at the kitchen table with the contents of the metal box spread before her, each document laid flat on a piece of acid-free cloth she'd brought in her bag, and she didn't say much while she worked. Her hands were completely steady throughout. She handled each document by the edges, turning it carefully in the light, moving her loops slowly across the surface. Emma watched from the doorway for 20 minutes before Nora told her to come in and sit down, and Dora Weiss, without looking up from the document she was examining, said, "She can watch. This kind of thing should be witnessed by someone who will remember it." Emma sat at the far end of the table and watched and didn't speak and wrote things in her notebook. When Dora Weiss finished, she sat back in her chair and folded her hands and said to Nora, "Do you understand what you have here?" "I'm beginning to," Nora said. Dora looked at the stack of documents before her. These were pulled from circulation in 1933. The ones in good condition, and several of these are in exceptional condition, given what they've been through, carry numismatic value well beyond face value. The high denomination ones particularly. She paused. There are collectors who have waited decades for material like this. She looked at Nora over her reading glasses. "You should be careful who you talk to." Nora had been careful. In the 3 weeks between Schoenfeld's first visit and the arrival of the formal document, she'd spoken to Arthur Greer, to Schoenfeld, to Dora Weiss, and to Emma. That was the complete list. She hadn't told Ruth Bellamy, hadn't mentioned anything to Gil, hadn't called Karen or Greta or anyone else who might spread the word before she understood what she had and what she intended to do with it. The document arrived in a large padded envelope on a Tuesday, and she sat at the kitchen table with it for a few minutes before opening it. Emma was at school. The stove was going. The lamp was on. Outside the kitchen window, the February sky was the pale, bleached white of late winter, a sky that looked like it hadn't decided yet whether to be done with the cold. She opened the envelope. The formal document ran to 11 pages. Schoenfeld had cataloged every coin individually, date, mint mark, denomination, condition grade on a scale she'd learned enough to read, estimated current market value, and the range for auction versus private sale. Dora Weiss had done the same for the paper currency. On the final page was the total, presented as a range, the low end reflecting conservative private sale estimates and the high end reflecting the premium that strong auction competition could produce. Nora read the low end. She'd heard it in the cellar the afternoon Schoenfeld told her, but seeing it in print on a formal document with letterheads and credentials attached was different from hearing it spoken in a cold cellar. It sat there on the page, solid and official, a number with more digits than anything she'd ever written in a client's accounts receivable column. She read the high end. She set the document on the table and looked at the kitchen wall. At the small sun Emma had drawn in pencil, the one Nora had painted around when she did the walls. The sun was still there, cream-colored now with the fresh paint around it, a small circle of original surface preserved inside the restoration. She picked up her phone and called Arthur Greer. "It came," she said. "I know. Philip sent me a copy yesterday, as you authorized." A pause. "How are you feeling?" "I don't have a word for it yet." "That's appropriate." His voice was warm, more personal than it had been in their early conversations. "I've completed the legal review. The property transfer is clean. Everything in that cellar was part of the estate Cecilia left you. The provenance on the coins and currency is consistent with the family's documented history. They acquired the farm in 1933, which aligns precisely with the minting dates. There's nothing that raises a legal question." Another pause. "You're clear, Miss Hadley. All of it is yours." She sat with that for a moment. "Arthur." "Yes." "Did you know? When you handled the estate, did you know something was there?" He was quiet for a moment. Not evasively, but thoughtfully, the way a man is quiet when he wants to answer correctly. "I didn't know what was there. But Cecilia came to see me 6 months before she died, to update the transfer paperwork to make sure the $7 fee was attached, that everything was set up so the heir could move quickly. She was very specific about making it easy to say yes." He paused. "She said to me, 'Arthur, someone is going to need this place. Make sure they can get to it.' That's all she said about it." Nora looked at the document on the table. "She spent 60 years with that wall in her cellar," Nora said. "She never touched it." "No." She understood that it wasn't hers to touch. He paused. "I think she believed it belonged to whoever needed it most. And she spent the last years of her life deciding who that was." After she hung up, Nora sat at the table for a long time. Long enough for the coffee to go cold. Long enough for the stove to need another log. She got up, put a log in, sat back down, looked at the document, and thought about a woman born in this house in 1935 who had lived in it for most of 89 years and had known, from some point forward, that there was something in the cellar her father had built and sealed and never explained, and had decided, not with carelessness but with deliberate and patient intention, to leave it sealed, to leave it for whoever arrived. That afternoon she drove to Gill's Hardware. She didn't need anything from the hardware store. She just needed to start telling someone, and Gill was someone she trusted, and the hardware store was a place where information moved in the way that information moves in small places, not with announcement, not with drama, just with the quiet passage of one person telling another, because the thing was true, and true things eventually travel. She told him while he was organizing a rack of drill bits, his back half turned to her, the way she'd noticed he was most comfortable receiving information that required him to absorb it before responding. He went still when she started talking. He didn't turn around until she finished. Then he turned. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who'd come into his store 3 months ago with $67 and a list of what she needed and a farmhouse on Dempsey Road that nobody thought was worth the time. He looked at her face, which was the face of someone who had received something large and was not yet sure how to carry it. He said, "Cecilia." Yes. She knew. She knew the wall was there. She didn't know exactly what was behind it. Or maybe she did, and she decided it wasn't hers to decide about. Gill set down the drill bits. He looked out through his front window at Dempsey Road, not visible from here, but in the direction of it, the way you look towards something even when you can't see it. "She was a good woman," he said. "She deserved better than dying alone in a caretaker's house." "She wasn't alone," Nora said. "She had you. She had Ruth. She had the whole county checking on her." "That's not the same as family." "No," Nora agreed. "It isn't." Gill looked at her. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to fix the house," she said. "And then I'm going to figure out the rest." By the following Thursday, Ruth Bellamy knew, and 3 people Ruth had mentioned it to in passing at the post office knew, and the pastor of the county church knew, because one of those 3 people attended Sunday services, and by the end of that week it had reached the town in the quiet, spreading way of rural news that doesn't require a newspaper or a broadcast, just a community small enough that things worth knowing find their way to everyone eventually. She was at the hardware store buying a hinge when she first heard it reach someone who hadn't heard it from her. A man she didn't know, buying sandpaper 2 aisles over, said to another man she didn't know, "You hear about the woman out on Dempsey Road? The Marsh farm?" She kept her back turned. "Cecil's place? What about it?" "Found something in the cellar." Old gold coins, they say. The whole thing sealed behind a brick wall. Been there since the Depression. Who told you that? Pastor Tom. He heard it from the Bellamy woman. A pause. How much gold? The man lowered his voice, which in a hardware store still carries 2 aisles. He named a figure. Not the right figure. It had traveled and changed the way figures do, but not small, either. Not wrong about the category. Nora bought her hinge and left. She was fixing the back door when Dale Sutton's SUV came up the track. She heard it before she saw it. That particular engine note, quieter and more expensive than any vehicle the county road usually produced. She set down her screwdriver and turned around. He parked where he always parked and got out in shoes that were, this time, slightly more appropriate for the season. Someone had told him something, or he'd heard something, or the way information moves in small places had reached even him, a man from the city who usually only received information he'd paid for. He looked different from the last time. The ease was still there, the practiced confidence, but underneath it something had shifted. He walked toward her with both hands in his coat pockets and a look on his face that was making an effort to arrange itself into something casual and not quite getting there. Miss Hadley. He nodded at the door she was fixing. Good morning. Good morning. I heard some news, he said. He said it in the tone of a man who has decided that directness is his best option now that indirectness has been overtaken by events. I imagine you did. I wanted to come by. In person. He looked at the farmhouse behind her. At the storm shutters she'd painted. At the new glass in the 2 upper windows she'd replaced last week with Owen's help. At the garden bed she'd cleared along the south wall, the frozen ground already turned and waiting for spring. At the rooster weather vane at the peak of the roof. He looked at all of it for a long time. Long enough that she could see him doing what he always did, calculating value, running numbers, and then something different happening, something slower, less practiced. He was looking at the house as if he hadn't seen it before, as if the house he'd driven past for 3 months and assessed and dismissed was a different house from the one in front of him now. I owe you an apology, he said. She looked at him. For what, specifically? He had the grace not to look away. For assuming I knew what this place was worth. You came here and offered me a number and called the house unsalvageable. I did. You said my situation would change and I'd want to sell. I did. He paused. I was wrong about the property. I was wrong about your situation. He held her gaze. I'm not here to make another offer. I just wanted to say that. She studied him for a moment. Dale Sutton was not a bad man. She'd decided this early on, and what she'd seen of him since hadn't changed it. He was a man who looked at things and saw only what they'd return, and who'd spent long enough doing that work that he'd stopped being able to see the other way. That was not a crime. It was just a limitation. Thank you for saying so, she said. He nodded, started toward his car, stopped. The coins, he said, his back to her. Did you know they were there when you decided to keep the place? No. He was quiet for a moment. Then he got in his car and drove away, and she picked up her screwdriver and went back to the door. She called Karen that afternoon. It was the first call she'd made to her sister since a brief check-in in late January, when she'd reported that the water was running and the heat was working and Emma was making friends at the county school. Karen had been cautiously relieved about all of this and had not said anything more about the structure being unsalvageable, which Nora had appreciated. Karen answered on the first ring, which told her that Karen had heard something and had been waiting for this call. Someone from that county called David about the property taxes, Karen said, before Nora could speak. He mentioned something he'd heard about the Marsh farm. What did he say he'd heard? He said there was gold. And he said a coin dealer from the city drove up there twice. A pause. Nora, tell me what's happening. She told her. All of it. The brick wall, the crates, the coins, the paper currency, the appraiser, the document. Arthur Greer's legal clearance. She told it the same way she'd told Greer and Schoenfeld, without drama, in the plain language of someone reporting what happened. But halfway through, she heard Karen's breath change. Not speaking, just breathing differently. Shorter. When Nora finished, Karen was quiet. Say something, Nora said. I told you the structure was unsalvageable. Karen's voice was strange, thin and low, not her usual register. You told me what someone told you. I said David could look into it. I said come stay with us. I said it didn't make sense to move Emma into a... She stopped. Started again. Nora, I was wrong. Yes. I genuinely thought it was a terrible idea. I thought the stress of the eviction had pushed you into a decision that didn't make sense, and I wanted to help you find a better one. I know. And I told a real estate contact that it was unsalvageable. I know. Karen was quiet again for a moment. Are you angry? Nora thought about this honestly, the way she thought about things she wanted to answer correctly. Not angry, she said. You said what you saw. You didn't see what I saw. What did you see? The bones, Nora said. Same thing you told me to look at. I just looked closer. Karen exhaled. It was a long, complicated exhale that carried more in it than a sound usually does. Can I come see it? When you're ready. Come in spring, Nora said. I'll have more done by then. And bring David. Even David? Even David, Nora said. The porch is solid now. He can see for himself. She heard her sister laugh, which was not something she'd expected, and she found herself laughing too, which was also not something she'd expected, because it wasn't really funny. None of it was funny except that it was, a little. The way the distance between where they'd been and where they were now was large enough to be almost comic if you stood far enough back from it. She called Greta that same evening. Greta picked up in the middle of something. Nora could hear the background sounds of a kitchen, something on the stove. Hold on, Greta said, and then some sounds of setting things down. And then, okay. Hi, what's going on? You remember the $600, Nora said. A pause. Yes. You don't have to. I want to pay it back. Nora, honestly, that was, and I want to pay it back with interest. She paused. Significant interest. Greta was quiet. Then, what happened? Nora told her. And this time, telling someone who had been at the curb when they loaded the car, who had pressed a $50 bill into her coat pocket and said don't, who had watched Emma drag her suitcase to the car and had hugged her for a long time at the curb. This time the telling was different. It arrived differently. It landed in a different place. Greta cried. Not the polite, restrained kind of crying that you pretend isn't happening on a phone call. The real kind. Nora, she said, twice, just the name. I know, Nora said. You went up there with nothing. I had $7 and a good flashlight. Emma's flashlight. Emma's flashlight, Nora agreed. Greta laughed through whatever she was crying, which was the specific sound of a person who is very happy about something that also hurts a little, because sometimes good things are like that. They arrive at the place where you stored all the hard ones, and when they get there it's complicated. The 600, Greta said, when she could speak again. Don't you dare. I already wrote the check. Nora, the interest goes in a separate envelope, Nora said. Don't argue with me. I know how to do math. The restoration of the farmhouse began in March. Not in the way of a renovation that brings in contractors and tears things open and replaces the old with the new, because that was not what the house needed and not what Nora intended. What she intended was closer to what Frank Mercer had done with his condemned jail on a gravel road in another story, in another county, in another life. She intended to find out what the house was supposed to be and then help it get back there. She hired Owen's nephew, a carpenter in his 30s named Marcus who had his grandfather's hands and his own patience, and she told him what she wanted. The porch rebuilt true and level, with the original style wood and hardware. The upstairs windows replaced with single-over-single double-hung windows that matched the proportions of the originals she'd found in a salvage yard. The two boarded windows opened up again, new glass, new framing, light coming through where light hadn't come in 12 years. The kitchen expanded slightly into a corner of the utility room that had been closed off at some point, giving her a proper workspace with a second counter and room for a table that didn't require eating on the floor. Marcus worked carefully and without hurry, which was right. He had a way of looking at old wood before he cut it that reminded her of how she'd looked at the farmhouse on that first November afternoon, seeing the shape of what it was supposed to be instead of the shape of what time had made it. He found things she hadn't found. A section of original wainscoting in the back bedroom, buried under 2 layers of later drywall, the wood intact and dry. A set of hand-forged iron door hinges in a paper bag on a shelf in the barn, still in their original oil wrap. A small window in the back stairwell wall that had been plastered over, which he uncovered and glazed, and which now brought light into the stairwell for the first time in who knew how long. Each thing uncovered was a small conversation with the house about what it had been and wanted to be again. Nora participated in every one. The roof was the largest job. She brought in a roofing company from the city and they worked for a week in late March, replacing the damaged sections, reinforcing the ridge line, patching the sag near the right chimney until it disappeared. On the last day, one of the roofers came down the ladder and knocked on the front door and told Nora he'd checked the weather vane while he was up there, the rooster that had been frozen southeast for as long as anyone remembered. He'd worked the mechanism free of rust, resealed the spindle, and reset it. That evening she stood in the yard and watched the weather vane turn. The wind was coming from the northwest, a March wind, the kind with some intention in it. The rooster turned into it and held, pointing northwest, swinging slightly with each gust. Moving. She stood there for a long time watching it move. Emma came out and stood beside her. Looked up. It's moving. I know. Did you fix it? The roofer did, while he was up there. Emma watched it turn in the wind. Cecilia must have watched it too, she said. For all those years. She must have. I wonder what she thought when it stopped moving. Nora looked at the rooster, its iron wings catching the last of the afternoon light. Maybe she thought the same thing I thought when I saw it frozen. That thing stops sometimes. And sometimes you just have to get up there and free them. Emma nodded, as if this were the obvious interpretation. She went back inside. Philip Schoenfeld had connected Nora with an auction house in the city, a reputable one with a numismatic division that handled material of this caliber with the seriousness it required. She met with their specialists in late February, two of them, a man and a woman who'd been assessing rare coins together for 15 years, and they'd taken the collection under secure transport to prepare for cataloging and eventual auction. It was a process that moved slowly by design. Rare coins of this type were not rushed to market. The right buyers needed time to know the material was available. The auction house wanted to do the material justice, which was their phrase, and Nora had learned to trust it because the house's reputation depended on doing it justice in a way that their reputation did not depend on doing it quickly. In the meantime, there was enough on deposit the more straightforward coins and silver, sold privately through Schoenfeld's established collector network, to address everything immediate. The restoration. Emma's school fund, set aside in an account Nora opened the same week the legal clearance came through. The check to Greta, with the envelope of interest. The insurance policy she'd never been able to afford. 3 months of mortgage payments made on the farmhouse Arthur Greer had helped her convert the property to a proper mortgage from the county transfer, giving her a legal financial foundation she hadn't had before. She paid Owen for the lumber he'd given her for free, at the price it would have cost at the lumber yard, plus enough extra that he stood at his truck for a moment looking at the check before putting it in his pocket. He didn't say anything about it. He just came back the following Saturday with his nephew Marcus to help frame in the kitchen expansion, and when Nora tried to pay for the labor he waved it off and said the check had covered it, which she knew wasn't true and he knew she knew, and they let it sit there between them as what it was. The way people in small places settled things without making a production of settling them. She paid Gil for the chimney brush and the weather stripping, which she'd originally paid cash for. And then she added to the payment the cost of everything else he'd given her on quiet credit over the winter: the insulation she'd needed for the upstairs hall, the pipe fittings for the kitchen sink, the 3 light fixtures she'd replaced in the ceiling when the old ones gave out. He started to argue and she pointed out that she'd kept a list, which was true, because she was a bookkeeper and keeping lists was how she understood the world. And he looked at the list and stopped arguing. Emma's school year ended in June with a ceremony at the county school's gymnasium, folding chairs on a gym floor, parents in the back rows, children in the front with their teachers. Emma came in with her class and found Nora in the second row and waved, the wave she used when she spotted something she'd been looking for. Her teacher, a young woman named Ms. Prentice who had taken Emma under her wing from the first week and had told Nora at the February conference that Emma was one of the most independently capable students she'd taught, said a few words about the year. Then the students got their certificates. Emma accepted hers with both hands and brought it back to her seat and looked at it, and Nora could see from 2 rows back the expression on her daughter's face. Satisfaction, specific and earned. The expression of a person who has done a thing that was difficult and knows it. Ruth Bellamy came to the farmhouse in April for the first time since January. She stood in the front yard and looked at the house for a long time before coming inside. The porch was rebuilt. The windows were in. The paint on the trim was new, the same cream color Nora had chosen to match what must have been the original, based on the traces she'd found behind the shutters. The garden bed along the south wall had been planted with the tomatoes and beans and herbs that Nora had started from seed on the kitchen windowsill in late February. Cecil would have done exactly that with the garden bed, Ruth said, pointing to the south wall. That's where she kept her herbs. Every year. I guessed, Nora said. The bed was already clear. Someone had used it before. Ruth looked at her. You guessed right. She walked through the house. Nora took her room by room, the way she'd been taken through it by Arthur Greer 11 months ago, but with a completely different tour to give. The sitting room with its fireplace going, the mantel cleaned, and the walnut railing at the stairs restored. The kitchen with its new counter and the table from the salvage yard, 6 chairs, room 4. Exceptional material does when the right people are in the room. Combined with the private sales of the silver and the lower denomination gold coins and Dora Weiss's sale of the paper currency to a collector she'd worked with for 20 years, the total was a number that Nora still had to read twice, each time, to let it be real. She was not wealthy in the way of people who have always had money. She didn't move differently or speak differently or decide that the things she'd valued before were worth less now that the pressure was off. She was wealthy in the way of a person who remembers exactly what it felt like to eat cold cereal from a too small bowl at a table that wasn't hers, and who intends to keep remembering it, because forgetting would be its own kind of loss. She set aside a fund for Emma's education, not a small one, the kind that would remain intact through whatever Emma decided to study and wherever she decided to study it, with enough remaining that the decision itself could be made freely, without debt shaping it. She told Emma about the fund on a Saturday morning, the same kitchen table, the same way she'd told her about the farmhouse 11 months before. Just the two of them, a lamp between them, the stove going. Emma asked how much. Nora told her. Emma looked at the table for a long moment, processing, the way she processed anything that required rearranging the landscape of what she understood to be possible. Then she looked up and her expression was not what Nora expected. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't relief. It was something quieter, the expression of someone who has been given room that they didn't know how much they needed until it appeared. I want to study architecture, she said. I've been thinking about it since we fixed the porch. Nora looked at her daughter, this 10-year-old who'd been making lists and measuring things and asking precise questions about structural integrity since the first day they drove up Dempsey Road, who had noted the best light in the house from the hallway window on her second visit, who had labeled every room in her notebook and watched Marcus the carpenter at work with the focused attention of someone filing things away for later. I think that makes sense, she said. Emma nodded. She picked up her pencil and wrote it in the notebook. Architecture. Underlined. Then she closed the notebook and finished her breakfast. There was one more thing Nora needed to do. She'd been thinking about it since the day Arthur Greer told her that Cecilia had arranged everything so that the heir could move quickly, that Cecilia had said someone is going to need this place, that Cecilia had spent the last years of her life deciding who and why. She'd been thinking about what a woman who had lived alone in a farmhouse for 50 years and given what she had to whoever arrived deserved in return. What her memory deserved. She spoke to Pastor Tom about it in the spring, and to Ruth Bellamy, and to Gil, and to Owen, and to the handful of people in the county who had known Cecilia Marsh and remembered what she'd been. She spoke to the County Historical Society, which turned out to be 3 people who met in the back of the library on alternating Thursdays and were deeply enthusiastic about anything to do with the county's agricultural past. What she arrived at was simple. Simple enough that Cecilia, a woman of few words and precise intentions, would have recognized it as right. The south garden bed along the farmhouse wall, the one where Cecilia had grown her herbs year after year, the one Nora had planted with tomatoes and beans without knowing it was carrying on a tradition, was expanded to run the full length of the south wall and around the corner to the east. Properly built, with raised beds and a gravel path between them and a small sign at the entrance that said, Cecilia Marsh's Garden, St. 1935. Every plant labeled. Every variety chosen from what Ruth remembered Cecilia had grown, supplemented by what Nora could find from the county agricultural records. It was not a museum. It was a garden. It was meant to be used, and it was. Ruth Bellamy came every week and worked in it. A woman from the county library came with her daughter on Saturdays to learn about herbs. Emma's class from the county school visited in the fall, and each student planted a garlic bulb for the spring. The pastor's wife grew her own tomatoes now from seeds that had started in Nora's kitchen window the February before, and she brought them to share at the church harvest supper and mentioned where they'd come from. The farmhouse itself was not a showpiece. It was a home, the kind of home that looks better the longer you spend time in it, because the things that make it good are the things you have to be present to notice. The way the morning light comes through the window in the blue room and falls across Emma's desk where she draws her building plans, increasingly detailed, increasingly serious. The way the sitting room fire sounds on a cold evening, the same sound it had made for 90 years. The way the kitchen smells of whatever's on the stove and the herbs drying in the rafters and the old wood of the beams, a smell that is specifically this farmhouse and nowhere else. She thought of Cecilia often, not with sadness, with something quieter than sadness and more permanent, with the sense that someone she'd never met had made a decision about her on the strength of a photograph and a belief about the kind of person who would understand what the house needed and had been right. And that being the recipient of that kind of trust was not something you discharged by spending money well or restoring a porch or planting the right herbs in the right bed. It was something you discharged by continuing, by staying, by leaving the door open the way the house's door had been left for her. She left it open, all year, all kinds of weather. Everyone. The upstairs rooms with their working windows and the blue room at the end of the hall where Emma slept, the pale blue paint restored and the trim white against it, and the window facing north over the back field. Ruth stood at the window in the blue room and looked at the field. This was Cecil's room, she said. She slept in here until she moved to the caretaker's. Nora was quiet. She could see the field from here. She told me once that she watched the seasons from this window. The whole cycle, year after year. She said it helped her understand time. Ruth turned from the window. She'd have been glad this is a child's room now. They had tea at the kitchen table, the new table, 6 chairs. Emma came home from school while they were there and sat at the table and told Ruth about her year in careful detail, what she'd learned, who her friends were, what Miss Prentice had said about the essay on local history that Emma had written about the farmhouse. Not about the cellar. About the house itself, its age, who had built it, and why, and what it had been through. You wrote about this house for school? Ruth said. For the county history project, Emma said. I got full marks. Ruth looked at Nora. Nora looked at Emma. Emma ate her biscuit. The auction was held in the city in October, 10 months after Nora had first pressed her hand to the loose mortar around the top left brick of the east wall. Philip Schoenfeld had prepared her for what to expect: the catalog that had gone out to registered bidders, the estimates, the reserve prices set below which nothing would sell. He'd prepared her for the possibility that some lots might not reach their estimates, because auctions were unpredictable and the market moved and nothing was certain until the hammer fell. What he hadn't prepared her for was the room. She'd expected something like a conference, functional and professional. What she found was a space with 200 seats, nearly all of them occupied, and a stage with a podium and a screen displaying each lot as it came up for bidding, and a room full of people, collectors, dealers, representatives bidding on behalf of clients who were watching via phone or internet from places she couldn't identify, who cared about these objects with an intensity that was clarifying to witness. These were people for whom a 1927 double eagle was not an abstract concept, but a specific thing, a piece of history with a known provenance and a rightful place in the world, and they had come prepared to demonstrate what that meant to them in the clearest possible language. Emma sat beside her. She'd asked to come, and Nora had said yes, because Emma had been part of every step of this, from the note about real flashlights and capital letters to the hour she'd spent holding the lights steady in the cellar while Nora worked the crowbar. She'd earned the right to see the end of it. She had her notebook. She had her pencil. She sat in her chair with her back straight and her eyes on the stage with the expression Nora had come to know as Emma's fully attending expression, nothing wasted, everything recorded. Schoenfeld sat on Nora's other side. He'd been to many auctions and showed it in the way of a person who knows how to wait. He didn't fidget. He watched the room instead of the stage, because the room was where the information was. Before the coins came up, he leaned toward Nora and said quietly, "The catalog went to 400 registered bidders. I know who's in this room and who's on the phones. There are collectors here for the 27D who've been waiting for available material for a long time." He looked at her. Trust the process. She trusted the process. The bidding on the first significant lot opened and moved fast. the auctioneer's voice steady and rhythmic, the numbers climbing in increments that Nora tried to track and couldn't, because they were moving too quickly, and her accounting training had not prepared her for the particular arithmetic of competitive desire. Emma held a small notebook in her lap and wrote down numbers as they were called, because Emma always had a notebook and always recorded what she saw. And when the hammer fell on the first lot, she looked at what she'd written and showed it to Nora. Nora looked at the number. It was above estimate. The second lot was above estimate. The third reached its high estimate exactly. The 1927 D Double Eagles, presented as a group lot with individual descriptions in the catalog, caused something in the room to shift when they came up. A stillness, a collective gathering of attention that Nora could feel from her seat. The bidding opened and moved faster than anything before it, and when it stopped, the room held a breath for just a moment before the hammer came down. Emma wrote the number and showed it to Nora. Nora stared at it. Then Emma wrote beneath it, her coin times 4. Nora stared at that too. She thought about a generic brand box of cereal and 2-day-old milk and a kitchen table that wasn't hers and a 9-year-old doing long division on the floor because they'd sold the second chair. She thought about 30 days on an eviction notice held up with a pineapple magnet. She thought about $600 borrowed from a friend and a car with a trunk full of canned goods and a notebook that said real flashlight in capital letters. She thought about $7 handed over a county clerk's desk for a transfer fee to a farmhouse on a gravel road that a developer had already decided wasn't worth the conversation. She thought about Cecilia Marsh, who had watched from 3 hours away and decided. Those two. When the time comes. When they need it. The final tally, when Schoenfeld gave it to her 2 weeks after the auction, was in the range he'd predicted at the high end of his assessment. Not every lot performed at peak, that was the nature of auctions. But the exceptional material had done exactly what he'd said, figuratively at least. The retired schoolteacher 2 counties over who'd lost her pension found a connection to Nora through the county welfare office and called on a Tuesday afternoon, and Nora talked to her for an hour and helped her understand what options she had and didn't let the call end until she'd given her 3 numbers to call. The young family from the valley whose landlord had sold the building found a reference from the pastor, and Nora helped them connect with the county housing office and put them in contact with Gil, who knew of a rental that hadn't been listed publicly yet. She didn't solve anyone's problems. She just paid attention and used what she knew and left what she had as available as Cecilia had left what was hers. One evening in late October, a year and a few weeks from the day she'd first turned up the track and seen the farmhouse through the bare trees, she sat on the front porch in the rocking chair Marcus had found at the salvage yard and sanded and refinished on a slow Saturday. He'd brought it over in the bed of Owen's truck without being asked and set it on the porch and gone back to his work without making a moment of it. The chair fit the porch the way things fit when they've found where they belong. Emma was at the kitchen table working on a sketch, visible through the window, head bent, pencil moving. She was drawing the backfield not as it was, overgrown and fenced, but as something else. A structure in it, low and open-sided, a kind of pavilion with a garden around it. She'd shown Nora the preliminary drawings last week and explained what she was thinking, using words that sounded like an architect's even though she was 10. Nora had looked at the drawings for a long time without speaking and then said, maybe. Emma had written that in the notebook. Maybe. The October light was going the way October light goes, warm and sideways, making ordinary things look considered. The porch was solid underfoot, the railing firm when she rested her arm on it. The garden was put to bed for the winter, the beds mulched, the last herbs harvested, the labeled wooden stakes still visible at the head of each row, Cecilia's name's in Nora's handwriting now. The sign at the entrance was just visible from here. The rooster on the roof turned northwest in a slow wind, easy and unhurried, as though it had always moved that way and the long years of rust had been an interruption rather than a conclusion. She thought about the morning the letter arrived. The pineapple magnet. The cold cereal. Emma on the floor with her long division. She thought about the $7 and what they'd purchased. She thought about a brick wall and a cellar that had held for 90 years, patient and immovable, waiting for someone to come looking. She thought about her mother, who'd worked 2 jobs and never quite gotten ahead, who had been vague about family in the way of people who carry old losses and don't know how to put them down, who had perhaps known, somewhere in the vague and carefully kept silence of what she didn't talk about, that there was a woman named Cecilia Marsh on a farm in Harlow County who had a photograph of Nora and Emma on her shelf. She thought about her mother, who'd worked 2 jobs and never quite gotten ahead, who had been vague about family in the way of people who carry old losses and don't know how to put them down, who had perhaps known, somewhere in the vague and carefully kept silence of what she didn't talk about, that there was a woman named Cecilia Marsh on a farm in Harlow County who had a photograph of Nora and Emma on her shelf, who had perhaps sent that photograph herself in a quiet moment as a kind of introduction. Or perhaps not, perhaps someone else had sent it, one of the shadowy cousins whose names Nora's mother had mentioned once and then not again. She would probably never know. She'd asked Arthur Greer, and he had no record of who had provided Cecilia with the photograph. Cecilia had left no explanation. Some things were simply the way they were, already finished before you arrived, shaped by people who were no longer there to account for their choices. She would never know for certain. Some parts of the story had closed before she arrived, the same way a door closes quietly and the latch falls and the room on the other side holds whatever it holds. You could press your ear to the wood and hear nothing, and that silence was its own kind of answer. The porch light came on. Emma, from inside, must have reached the switch. The light came through the front window and touched the floorboards of the porch and made the grain in the wood show, the wide pine that had been here since 1933 and intended to remain. Nora looked at the farmhouse around her and in front of her and at the field beyond and the tree line past that and the October sky above everything, pale at the horizon and darker toward the center, the kind of sky that looked like a held breath right before it exhaled into night. She'd inherited a crumbling farmhouse for $7. She'd found gold in the cellar, yes. She'd found coins and currency and the accumulated hoard of a man who'd trusted the ground under his house more than he'd trusted the banks, who had believed that the earth was more reliable than institutions, that what you could lock behind brick and mortar was safer than what you handed to strangers behind counters. He'd been right about that, in his way. The institutions had failed. The banks had closed. The money had vanished from accounts that people had spent lifetimes filling, and his gold had sat in the dark and waited, patient and indifferent, for the world to find its feet again. It had waited 90 years. It had waited for this. She'd found a number that changed the arithmetic of her life in every direction at once. But she'd also found something that didn't have a numismatic value or an auction estimate or a formal appraisal document. She'd found the blue room and the pale winter light and Emma doing her homework on the floor of the kitchen on their first night by the fire, saying we're going to fix everything as though the outcome were simply a question of deciding. She'd found Gil at the hardware store and Ruth Bellamy with her covered dish and Owen with his salvage lumber and the pastor with his firewood and a whole county of people who showed up without announcement and gave without keeping count. She'd found out what she was made of, which turned out to be the same things the house was made of. Old bones, set right, tended honestly, capable of more than anyone looking at them from the road could see. $7. That's where it started. $7 and a letter and a woman who decided that yes, whatever was on the other side of that envelope, she was going to open it. The porch held. The fire was going inside. Her daughter was at the table drawing buildings. The weather vane moved in the wind. This was the place. This was home. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.